Hey Vainglorians, this is Gadianton from BrokenMyth.net, and we're going to be covering the 1.15 update a little bit differently this time, in more of a roundtable format. Today I'm joined with Broken Myth writer Kelda Gar, and additionally we have a long-time Vainglory veteran with whom you may recognize from his tier lists, Wailmer, both of which, just by coincidence, happen to be also members of the Ardent Guild. So welcome, guys.
How's it going?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome, thank you, guys. So, as a reminder, much like the last update video we did, as we go through these patch notes, keep in mind that we're not covering every little detail. So if you're wondering if a certain hero was nerfed or buffed or whatnot, it's very possible they were. We're just covering the most significant things and doing so in a greater level of detail. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. One of the things you may have noticed in the previous release was that they made it so that when a turret dies, your respawn timer will go down by 15%. So if your initial cooldown was 60 seconds, then it would go drop by 9 seconds. However, they found that that was a little bit too much. They've reduced that down to 10% because the primary objective here that Super Evil's trying to accomplish is that they're trying to make sure that you won't get aced and the other team's able to knock down 4 or 5 turrets all in quick succession and end the game right there. However, by making this respawn timer refund a little bit too big, it made it so it started dragging games out a little bit longer than they wanted to. The other part that's really important to note here is that jungle monsters, there was a huge buff, of course, in the last release, and they've made it so that now that this will scale with net gold rather than with time. In particular, that players in the lower tiers who didn't necessarily farm as efficiently were struggling a little bit, and so Super Evil feels this will be a better way to be able to accomplish that. There is one other interesting change here, which is Frostburn. I think the only item that was changed in this patch. Keldegar, did you have some thoughts on kind of this change? It seems like a small change, but also a lot of times small changes can be more significant than they appear.
Yeah, so Frostburn is obviously a really popular item in a lot of crystal builds. It offers a lot of crystal power, 100 crystal power, for only 2400 gold, and the utility of a slow. It was usually built first on a lot of heroes, especially the very popular crystal carries. So by increasing the price, it might open up different build paths. It's only 400 gold less than a Shatterglass now. I think it's an interesting change, and we'll have to see how it affects the meta.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a few times I've seen in the EU meta, for example, where like Sky, which popularly always leads off with Frostburn, a few people have actually been going with a Shatterglass on occasion. And it makes me wonder if maybe by increasing the price of Frostburn, maybe people will start experimenting a little bit more and trying out something new in that regard. So, hero changes. There's a lot of different hero changes. In fact, this release, there's not a new hero. There's a lot of really new and awesome skins that you guys will certainly want to check out. You're going to notice that this is a more of a quality of life release. There's a lot of bug fixes, a lot of improvements to different heroes and so forth. And so let's go ahead and kick things off with Fortress. Keldegar, you've done a little bit more look into Fortress than I have. What are your thoughts on this change? And actually, if you want to introduce the change as well.
Sure, so the primary change to Fortress is they changed his ultimate attack of the pack. Crystal Fortress right now is a very strong jungle carry in North America and also in East Asia. Basically, the issue with it right now is that you cannot damage his wolves with any ability damage. You can only damage them with basic attacks. So the change that they're making is now that they'll be able to be damaged by these abilities, but the values that they're using right now, he's going to have 150 armor and shield and up to 600 health for the wolves, plus 20% of Fortress's bonus defensive stats. The part of this that I have run into problems is that they still are very, very extremely tanky. Wailmer does have a great point that before you couldn't damage them at all, and now you can, so there is that. However, my feeling is that they're still a little bit too strong, but we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, this will absolutely help Celeste, Scarf, Sky during their forward barrage, heliogenesis. Anything that has indiscriminate damage, they'll be able to finally damage the wolves instead of just having to succumb to autoing them and eventually dying to them. So.
Well, I don't know if I noticed this previously, but so if we weren't doing ability damage to these Attack of the Pack wolves, were they essentially being like the ultimate body blockers for a forward barrage?
Correct. They would actually absorb damage.
That is just craziness. So at the very least, it sounds like, I mean, I'm looking at the numbers here, 150 armor and shield, and that's pretty high health per wolf. So I'm imagining that the effective health here is pretty huge, not to mention that you're also getting Fortress's bonus defensive stats, which if you're building a typical Fortress or classic Fortress, which is as a roam with some tankiness, then these are super, super tanky. And I don't know if you're still going to be able to chew through one of those in a forward barrage, but nonetheless, at least you're doing some form of a damage to them.
And it's important to note that the basic attacks still strictly deal a third of the wolf's health. So at minimum, you should be able to kill these wolves faster with the ability to now target them with skills, because you'll still be able to get the same 3 attacks off.
So no matter how tanky these now are, or they appear, the reality is you're not going to be killing them any slower. If anything, you're just going to be killing them faster.
Right.
But that's not to say that CP Fortress is completely out of the picture. He's still going to be a very strong carry.
That's a good point. I don't think this is going to change the fact that CP Fortress has become a thing. Then there's, of course, Kestrel. Kestrel, I'll cover really briefly. The idea behind this is actually kind of building upon what already started to take place in 1.14. Actually, the arrow recharge time is now gone from 4 seconds down to 3.3 seconds, which is actually exactly what it was in 1.13. Kestrel was really powerful. They thought, wow, we really need to kind of scale that back a little bit. They increased the recharge time to 4 seconds, and they found probably a little bit too much. And so because there was also other changes wrapped up in that as well. So they're bringing that back down to 3.3 seconds, which may cause us to see a resurgence of Kestrel. The other part, though, kind of building upon the update in 1.14, was that Super Evil wasn't seeing that active camo was being used very much at all. So they decided, let's go ahead and dramatically reduce the energy cost of this ability. Nonetheless, they're still saying that people aren't using active camo as much as they'd like, so they're increasing the amount of damage by actually quite a significant amount here. I can imagine like a CP Kestrel being able to just do some massive burst damage from this, especially AoE damage. Wailmer, I remember talking to you earlier today about Koshka. It seemed like you had some interesting thoughts in regards to these changes and how it might impact the game.
Yeah, so SEMC changed the cooldown on Koshka's Pouncy Fun and her Twirly Death and increased both of them. She's currently able to be one of the strongest heroes in the early jungle from levels 1 to 6, and gives so much intense pressure and constantly kite in and out with her mobility from the speed boost from Twirly Death, and also re-engage with Pouncy Fun. With both cooldowns now increased, it's going to be much more difficult for her to get that Pouncy Fun off again. It usually means that she'll have to utilize her perk and get in a couple auto attacks to be able to have that Pouncy Fun up again to ensure that she can cast it and re-engage. I think with these changes, Koshka is going to become less of a, oh, I see a target, I'm going to just directly use my skills and engage without thinking. And you're going to have to, actually sit there and think, am I going to go in right now with Pouncy Fun knowing that I may not have Pouncy Fun or Twirly Death up as quick as before? And this also goes to some of the Ringo changes. Ringo had his energy costs increased for both his Achilles Shot and Twirling Silver. Both of these heroes were very consistent early game. Ringo, like Koshka, could constantly engage with Twirling Silver and Achilles Shot and constantly chug Halcyon Pots, which is actually a core item of Ringo, and then have enough energy to be able to use them after a few subsequent uses. So both of these heroes now are going to require a bigger decision on the player side to make sure that they're effective.
Kelda Gar, you're a longtime Cruel player. I'm very curious to go ahead and get your insights into Cruel, and I guess Cruel or Crawl or however you want to say it, everyone has their own pronunciation. Let me begin by saying that there's been a lot of changes to Crawl this time around, and Super Evil wants to make Crawl viable as also a CP carry now. And so there's been some magic that they're working here to try to make the numbers work so that also weapon power is not overpowered. But once again, Kelda Gar, I'll let you kind of take it from here.
I actually was a long-time Crawl player. You might say that Adiandris learned his breaking point build from me.
He's not here to contest it.
But it is interesting. The changes that they're making, they want to make Crystal Crow a viable build path. So what they're doing is they're removing the base damage, which used to do crystal damage, and transferring it to actually just a basic attack. So it's going to be a boosted basic attack plus a 70% crystal ratio. What this means is that instead of base crystal damage, it's doing all weapon damage, which will affect breaking point. It will now stack breaking point, and it also means that it can do critical damage. I think the reason they did this was they didn't want the crystal damage on it to become overpowered when you start stacking all of those crystal items. So they're kind of evening it out by splitting the damage to weapon. And then the barrier, this is the huge change. They are really amping the ratio on the barrier. It is increasing from 75% to 125%, and it will now increase the duration by 0.02% CP ratio. So every 100 crystal you add, it's going to last an additional 0.2 seconds.
With a little bit of crystal power and a little bit of cooldown speed, it seems like you could have your shield up a great amount of the time.
That's right. So the cooldown on Dead Man's Rush remains the same at 8 seconds. And so if you start reducing that and adding to the duration of the barrier, you're looking at maybe 1.5 seconds of downtime between barriers, which can be a very deadly thing.
Well, I can only imagine if you have like a shatter glass. I mean, already at a rank 5, your barrier is going to be at close to 800 health. Most people aren't going to chop through 800 health within a 3-second window of time. So that's pretty crazy.
Yep, and then you add maybe a clockwork and a crystal infusion, and the cooldown suddenly is somewhere between 4 and 5 seconds.
So it's up almost all the time.
Basically.
Yeah, and speaking about infusions, these crystal changes make it so that Kroll's crystal scaling in the late game is going to be very powerful. So I'm really curious to see how a double fusion Kroll performs in this patch. I think it could be quite a force to reckon with.
That's definitely one of the things to consider, and we totally saw Alliance do this in the recent finals of the VGL qualifier 2. They double infuse, and they use heroes that benefit from double infusions the most.
I think, did we mention, talk about weakness stacks? I think that's actually the most significant change. Possibly.
We did not. Let me jump to that, and then we'll go back to Spectral Smite in a moment. But this is a significant change. Tackle this one, Wailmer.
Yeah, so previously his weakness stacks on basic attack applied a 10% reduction to attack speed or crystal power. They changed that now to a 6.25% general damage reduction. So you have a 50% reduction when you have full 8 stacks on a target. This is really interesting to me because before in the past, Kroll would be really effective on weapon power heroes with attack speed, so targets like Ringo or Saw. But with this change, he'll also be extremely effective now against heroes like Weapon Power Jewel or Weapon Power Guy, which in the past really didn't function off any weapon attack speed. So this is, on that side, that's definitely a buff for Kroll. And then in terms of crystal power heroes, I think we did the math, and Kelda Gar, did you say it was about the same?
I think it's actually a buff for Kroll, because if you look at this, now will reduce base damages, and it varies on hero to hero, but I think I was mentioning earlier, most late game heroes have around 200 to 300 crystal power. So if you're reducing that by 80%, then you're looking at a significant number. But base damages range anywhere from 200 to 1,000, even 1,500, I think, for Jewel's base damage. Reducing that by 50% is going to be a very significant number.
Yeah, so he's definitely going to be much more effective versus, a wider spectrum of builds now.
I agree. I really like what you were saying earlier. There's definitely a larger amount of weapon power casters out there. You mentioned the Sky, you mentioned Jewel, but I mean, even Rona's ult is all weapon damage. Or also there's Kestrel. Kestrel as well is a weapon power caster with her Glimmer Shot when she's weapon power build. And in those cases, his stacks would not be able to affect them because they weren't based on attack speed. That damage isn't based upon crystal power. And so I think this is actually a very nice quality of life change for Kroll to kind of update him for these new heroes and new builds that are we're seeing a lot more out in the fold. The other thing that's worth noting here as well is some changes to Spectral Smite. Generally, I mean, and I don't know if you have additional insights in this, Kelda Gar, but to me, at face value, it seems like this is just basically saying, all right, we're going to bump up the crystal ratios here because we want Cruel to be more viable as a crystal power hero. But other than that, I'm not seeing anything at a quick glance that appears like it's a dramatic change in this regard. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, they had the ratios a little bit higher and it was kind of overpowered. So they tuned it back a little bit and I think it's in a better place. And like what you said, they're looking at making it more beneficial to run crystal power and not have it just be such high base values. So weapon power Kroll could, abuse Spectral Smite.
So this brings up an interesting thought because we're now moving into a territory where we're taking a traditionally weapon power hero. And there's other heroes out there that are either traditionally weapon power or traditionally crystal power. But we're now taking an old classic hero that's traditionally weapon power and saying, hey, guess what, guys? We're going to incentivize you to make this crystal power. And it seems to be kind of building into a theme we've been seeing with a lot of the most recent heroes, even Ozo, Kestrel, Sky, where they want us to be able to take most heroes and to be able to build them multiple different ways. And not only is that cool, because it gives me flexibility, so if someone comes along and they say, I'm going to run the Crystal Vox, I can say, okay, well, I'll run weapon power Cool, or vice versa. And the thing that dawns on me, though, with this is not just the flexibility, which is really kind of nice and convenient, but also it makes me wonder if we need to they need to start thinking about reworking the default builds inside the in-game client, because it's now like, okay, well, I'm running Crawl, and I want to run this crystal power, but it doesn't have like a crystal power path right now. And it's going to have one or the other. And so I'm almost wondering if they're going to have to start revamping that from a usability perspective. So like, I don't know, I just signed up to do weapon power Vox, and maybe crystal power is the default build, and doing that accordingly.
Just to touch on that subject real quick, you mentioned, I mean, most of the time when we talk about heroes, we talk about weapon power or crystal power. And that's true, of course, for some heroes that, like Scarf or Celeste, that definitely benefit from one over the other. But if you look at, let's say, Cole, when he was playing Ringo in VGL, he often bought an Aftershock along with a Tension Bow and a Sorrow Blade on his Ringo. And I wonder if SCMC is leaning towards a direction where we'll be talking about hybrid builds all the time. And Kroll, I think, with these changes, is a very likely candidate.
I have been waiting for that breakthrough. In fact, I've been monitoring this very closely, and I've heard some people mention rumors of like hybrid Sky or hybrid Kestrel. I've never seen anything really be standardized or become popularized yet. And every time I see changes like this, I'm wondering when we're going to see our first breakthrough hybrid. I mean, Tension Bow Aftershock is something we've seen for a long time. We've seen it on Ringo since the beginning of days. We've seen it on Taka since the beginning of days, because it's like this ultimate burst combo. Neither one of them are really, both of them are kind of burst items, and I wouldn't necessarily classify them specifically as weapon power or crystal power, even though I guess they are. But in any case, yeah, I really like this concept of this possibilities of having hybrid builds down the road, or where you can start off building in one direction and see how your opponents are building defense and switch directions, and this kind of new level of strategy and competitiveness.
I think the last point to make on the viability of both weapon and crystal builds is draft and flex picks. This gives you a lot more flexibility in draft, and that's definitely a focus of SCMC.
You're right that the whole advent of flexibility in builds allows us a lot more flexibility when it comes to the draft, which we all know is going to be coming to ranked queue for everyone somewhere down the road, and we'll want to be prepared for that. So Petal, we're starting to see Petal in competitive play. This is awesome. However, there's still things to be done with Petal. In fact, we just saw this past weekend in competitive play, Petal being used and abruptly stomped by Contraption. And that's because Contraption, if you're not aware of it, will Stormguard, Banner, Contraption, Warhorn all do true damage to minions. And I guess that's Petal's Munions included. And so what they've done is, as a quality of life improvement for Petals Munion, so they don't just get swatted down by roam players, basically what they've done is they've dropped the armor and shield benefits and greatly buffed up the health benefits. And at the end of the day, however, Keldegar, I think you did the math, it ends up being roughly equal when it comes to effective hit points.
That's right.
So at the end of the day, the idea here then is the Munions are basically just as tanky as they used to be, but they're less susceptible to being beaten up by Contraption, Warhorn, Stormguard, Banner. However, as one additional thing to help bring Petal into the spotlight, they've also went ahead and made some changes to Trampoline. Keldegar, did you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, so Trampoline, what they did was, now when you use Trampoline, so you have to have a seed on the ground and you use Trampoline, it will amplify Petal's weapon power and crystal power for 4 seconds. So it will amplify weapon power by up to 24% and crystal power for up to 35%. So this means that this introduces a new layer of scaling for Petal. One of her, I guess, weaknesses is that people felt she didn't scale very well in the late game. And so this is adding a whole new layer of scaling for Petal to scale in the late game. So this is a little different than, say, Broken Myth, which amplifies all crystal damage. This will only amplify Petal's crystal power. So that means the part of her abilities that have a crystal ratio, those will be increased. But this also means that this will increase her healing. Unlike Broken Myth, which only amplifies damage, this will amplify her healing as well. And because of this new ability amplifying her power so much, they had to increase the cooldown so she didn't have it up all the time, because it was a little overpowered. But that's pretty much what they're trying to accomplish with this. Give her a little bit more scaling into the late game and a little more oomph.
What I find interesting about this is, unlike with like Krull or some of the other heroes we've looked at, where they're reworking like just kind of the numbers, in this case they've taken an ability of Petals that was, if I'm not mistaken, purely utility, and now they've actually added like some damage amplification on it that never before existed on this ability. And so this is a brand new addition to the damage that Petal can essentially display. The other thing that's interesting about this is I can imagine some interesting strategies when it comes to kind of kiting or leaping forward. You could leap forward onto people and have this nice damage boost to go on with that, whether you're chasing people or just trying to kind of do a nice burst of damage out of the gate.
Trampoline into her ultimate.
Exactly.
Give a huge boost to your crystal power and then just blow people up with your ultimate.
Also, just going back to Keldegar's point about her scaling, we saw this in the recent DGL NA finals, Gangstar Series versus Alliance. There was a point where Alliance was pretty shaken and they were against Fuji on Petal, but once they got the 6 infusions, Petal just couldn't match that type of power because she didn't benefit from the weapon power infusion as much. And with this change, she's going to get both an increase to both of her infusions. Moving forward, like when teams are trying to strategize for that late game push, it's really important to identify which heroes have that double infusion benefit. So these changes will definitely increase Petal's utility in the end game.
Yeah, I mean, by the sounds of it, I mean, if they had to reduce the cooldown to make sure it wasn't overpowered, or to increase the cooldown, that is, then it sounds like it's definitely going to be a great addition to Petal's kit for sure. Finn is still a hero that Super Evil wants to see more competitively, wants to see as not just kind of niche role still. I think, I'm trying to recall Wailmer or Kelda Gar, I don't remember which of you had more thoughts on this one, but either one of you are welcome to jump in.
I think the main change here is that at max rank, his Polite Company duration is increased by 1 second, from 3 to 4 seconds. So last patch, they increased the duration from 2 to 3 seconds, and I definitely felt that when playing with Finn. And to increase it again by another second is actually a really big deal, I think. You're going to see Finn using it in a team fight and giving his carries all of this fortified health for 4 seconds, and it's going to make a big difference.
I just want to add, they increased his level 1 health from 881 to 960. Finn's actually a really strong level 1 engager, and He usually would have difficulty fighting at level 1 against certain mobile heroes like Sky, or a lot of heroes that can constantly get out of position and then engage back onto Finn. I think this level 1 health, even though it's only 10%, it's going to make him a lot more significant in the early game and potentially part of early game pushes.
Once again, I think that Super Evil's definitely, they've been consistently making changes to Finn. In fact, they continue to make him more and more powerful. And I think that one day, maybe this is the release that we're going to wake up and go, holy cow, Finn's really awesome. And he's more awesome than we anticipated. And then everyone's going to start playing him. Rona. So Rona, Rona's an interesting one as well. So Red Mist was broken last release. I don't know if everyone realized that or not, but there was a bug. When she did her Red Mist, she didn't generate fortified health. And so what happened was, in the test environment, they fixed it, and they were like, holy cow, Rona is really, really powerful. In fact, she's too powerful. We can't kill her. And so while they did fix the bug, they're also bringing kind of a slight nerf to it right out of the gate, because unfortunately, they didn't want her to be too powerful. But Super Evil's reporting that she's still really awesome and that she's going to be a great threat in this patch. So I'm really excited to see that. Keldegar or Wailmer, did you have any additional insights or thoughts into that?
I mean, if you look at her changes, they upped her Berserker's Fury by 5%, and her Foe Splitter weapon ratio up by 5%. They're not that significant, but Rona was actually a top hero in the autumn season, and there hasn't been that many changes to her since. So just by fixing this bug, and also I think there was a bug on Foe Splitter, Rona could potentially be an extremely strong hero again.
I think that's a very important note. And sometimes I think that we can overlook that. A lot of times there's these little, like almost like footnotes in the patch notes, where it's like at the very bottom, it's like, here's the bug fixes. And it's almost like these are insignificant things. There was one release back in April of earlier this year where they fixed a bug. They said, we fixed Taka's heroic perk. That was it. That was all they said. Nothing fancy. This was a big fix or anything like that. And it caused Taka to become like the hero of like several releases after that. He was so incredibly awesome just because his heroic perk worked. And it's very possible that some of these changes and fixes, albeit seemingly small to Rona, could bring her back into the light, much like Wailmer's suggesting. And so that kind of brings us to the end of the preview. There's certainly other things. I encourage you to go ahead and review the full patch notes. But there's one of the conversation topics I thought might be interesting to talk about before we conclude, and that is, what sort of changes are we not seeing in Update 1.15? Wailmer, Keldegar, what are your thoughts?
Oh, before we go into that, I just wanted to note quickly that Saw's base armor and shield were nerfed in his early levels. It breaks even at Keldegar, do you remember? Oh, breaks even at level 6 to 7, right? So his early push ability is going to be, it's nerfed. He's going to be more susceptible to dives early game, and I think that's a big unanimous sigh of relief by everybody who's annoyed by Saw push comps in this current meta.
Well, then also in solo queue now, if you're a roam player, you might as well just camp lane because Saw is squishier. So what do you guys think? What are the other changes that are the lack thereof that maybe we would have expected to see in this release that we didn't see?
I was a little surprised that Adagio or Blackfeather didn't have bigger changes. Adagio's often banned out. He's extremely strong in buff comps. We saw him played heavily in VGL by top teams. Alliance used him super effectively with locks. So I'm a little surprised that Adagio maybe didn't have some tweaking. And also Blackfeather. Blackfeather is often picked as a laner right now. And we know that when he gets to level 12 and he gets his farm, he becomes such a hard counter to so many heroes. So I'm a little surprised that we didn't see Blackfeather tweak this patch.
I'm a little curious as to the state of Sky. I think the current meta kind of stifled her because of Fortress's Wolves being basically blocking her forward barrage. But I think she's still an incredibly strong hero, as we saw in draft, where there is no Fortress. Koldamig played Sky very well to win 2 of the 3 games. and her CP scaling on her forward barrage is off the charts. So I do have a feeling that Sky is definitely going to be back in the meta.
At the beginning of this patch, Weapon Power Sky was like, there was people that were outraged about Weapon Power Sky. Like, she was just going and destroying everybody. And then that kind of like faded off into the night. I don't know if that was something that had to do with CP Fortress, and now there's these wolves running around that ultimately cannot be killed, or what the deal with that was. But I mean, I don't picture that's gone away. Additionally, we had a very big change in Breaking Point in 1.14, and it seems like things are remaining the same. So either Super Evil's very content with where things are at, or it's very possible they're continuing to collect data points to figure out if maybe Breaking Point needs to be buffed or nerfed or anything like that. So those are my 2 pennies, and in fact, I think that's the close. So thank you, Wailmer. Thank you, Keldegar. You've both been awesome. I appreciate your insights, and I hope this has been useful to each of you. I wish you the best in Update 1.15. Thank you.